speaking the last 4 years, I've got about 14 versions of the talk, The Constitution and Donald Trump. Frankly, I'm kind of happy to be getting to the end of those talks. And this is kind of a bit of a summation of it. If you wanted to have all the talks back to back, I could probably have you here for about a good 10 hours straight, which would be miserable about all the constitutional issues. But it's a good way to learn about the Constitution. So, do you want me to just go ahead and jump in now to the talk with questions, etc.? I'll certainly have time at the end for questions, and if you want to shoot some questions during it, I'm happy to do it. I'll try to pause at each section to give a chance for questions. Okay, well, hopefully we've got the end of the Donald. There we go. The last days of Trump. We've waited a long time for this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Electoral College, and it was, of course, relevant in this recent election. Breaking news, as many of you may know, Joe Biden was not elected president of the United States in November. Nor was he actually even president-elect in November. He was called that, but he's actually not. He was not president-elect until the electors met, which did not happen until December 14th. As many of you may know, and I doubt there might be somebody here that this would not apply to, but I would venture to guess that nobody on this call, myself included, has ever voted for President of the United States. We don't vote for President of the United States. We vote for a slate of electors that are chosen by the parties who then vote for President of the United States. Biden becomes president. Congress has to certify in the case of a tie in the Electoral College. The whole reason why this whole thing ended up in Congress this week on the 6th was because if there's a tie in the Electoral College, the Constitution provides that the House of Representatives decides then who is president by vote per state, each state getting only one vote, which is horribly undemocratic, but that's why you have to go through this certification process in the Senate and the Congress. Okay, so January 6th, Joe Biden becomes president-elect. He doesn't actually become president until January 20th. At 12 noon, Donald Trump's term, 12 noon on January 20th, is when Donald Trump can no longer do damage as president of the United States. So you get the joint session of Congress, states send certified slates, Congress accepts the slates, objections can happen as we saw, and of course since Arizona is way up there high in the first of the alphabet, Arizona was the first one objected to, and then all hell broke loose in the Capitol to hold up the count. All right. I will talk a little bit more about this toward the end of the talk, because I think what happened was disturbing, profound, but I also see something kind of positive in it. Now, the Constitution, Fifth Amendment says, no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. There is a picture of my son, who has done what many of my clients should have done. All these people who took pictures of themselves can now be amenable to prosecution. And they themselves have provided all the evidence you need to prosecute them for the crimes they committed. So, selfies are self-incriminating, but they're not compelled, so they can be used against them. Debating the tally, I think most people know this. It goes back when there's an objection in writing that's affirmed by a senator, then it goes back to the two houses. They split back up, debate it for no more than 2 hours, and each person can speak only one time for no more than 5 minutes. Then they return to a joint session. If one house finds the objection is good, and let's say the Senate doesn't, or vice versa, then the objection is no good. Both houses have to find that the certification is bad. The statute here is 3 U.S.C. section 15 through 17, if you ever are inclined to want to look this up yourself someday. All right. This election was certainly not the biggest election mess. That award goes to the 1876 election. Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Oregon all had contested results. It bounced into this tally. What eventually happened, well, this was what led to the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which is the act that we use today for counting these things. This is the process of how this happens. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes beat Samuel Tilden. He cut a deal with the Southern delegates to end Reconstruction. And that's how Rutherford B. Hayes, Republican, became President of the United States. As the cartoon of the time with Rutherford walking up with a plump bottom south, cutting a devil with Mephistopheles, is what happened there. All right, what the effect of that was truly profound. In 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. All the gains, or nearly all the gains that were made in civil rights and the rights of black people in the South, as well as even poor Southerners, were just totally wiped out, as if the Civil War never happened. So from 1890 to 1908, Southern states disenfranchised most black people and many poor whites. This exclusion lasted well until the federal civil rights legislation of the 1960s. And in fact, still today. I mean, it's an amazing thing that the South lost the war, but they actually won the peace. And in many ways, they got the chance to write the history with this whole revisionist, lost cause narrative, which is totally wrong. Totally not what was going on at all. But they created this lost cause narrative. And frankly, today, even today now, we're dealing with that. You know, this whole issue about Donald Trump not wanting to rename military bases? They were named after Southern Confederate traitors who took up arms against the United States. That is still the legacy of this entire period. All right. If you recall Al Gore in 2001, remember he lost the election in 2000. There were several Democrats that jumped up and contested the count. Al Gore gavelled them down. Remember, he was sitting as president of the Senate because he was Bill Clinton's vice president. So he was president of the Senate, as was Mike Pence. And so he put an end to that whole thing. In 1961, there was a dispute about 3 electoral votes from Hawaii. What happened was the 3 electoral votes initially went for Richard Nixon. They were certified by the Hawaiian governor. There was a recount, and the governor recertified them for John F. Kennedy. Basically, this went, and again, Vice President Nixon, who was Eisenhower's vice president, was president of the Senate in supervising this whole count, and he put an end to it as well. I cannot think of a more striking and eloquent example of the stability of our constitutional system. In our campaigns, no matter how hard fought they may be, no matter how close the election may turn out to be, those who lose accept the verdict and support those who win. It is in that spirit that I now declare that John F. Kennedy has been elected President of the United States and Lyndon B. Johnson, Vice President of the United States. Look, folks, this is Richard Nixon. I mean, Richard Nixon got it right and said something to his everlasting credit in this election. All right. Looks like Mike Pence actually kind of finally stood up, but it's been a long time coming. All right. So we've already talked about some of this. We vote for electors. The Electoral College is determined. There's 335 congresspersons, plus 100 senators, plus 3 extra for the District of Columbia. That gives you 538 electors. 1/2 of 538 is 269, which means whoever gets 270 electoral votes wins. They become President of the United States. 6 states have 3 electors. Their populations would never justify it. So you've got Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Alaska, and Vermont. Most of those, as you can see, are red. Basically, here's the one Wyoming voter has roughly the same voting power as 4 Arizona voters. So a Wyoming voter has 4 times more power than you do to select who's President of the United States. Okay, James Wilson, James Madison, and others wanted the popular election of the executive, but they agreed to the Electoral College to protect against cabals, corruption, intrigue, and faction. I don't think that really worked too well. Madison also recognized the problem with the popular vote in slavery. The right of suffrage was much more diffuse in the North than in the Southern states, and the latter could have no influence in the election on the score of Negroes. The substitution of electors obviated this difficulty and seemed on the whole to be liable to the fewest objections. In other words, what the Electoral College did was it made up for the fact that the South didn't have a very good tradition of voting in the first place, and they had excluded from the vote all persons of color, so that basically the Electoral College perpetuated the slave power. Now, in Federalist 68, Alexander Hamilton writes, the electors come directly from the people to avoid a party-run legislature. The electors guard against somebody unqualified but with a talent for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity attaining the presidency. Okay, that's Federalist number 68. Obviously, it didn't work out that way in the least. The Electoral College hasn't done that, and it's a total and complete failure, at least from what the point of the framers were. Robert Jackson had written in Dissent in 1952, no one familiar to our history can deny that the plan originally contemplated what was implicit in its text, that the electors would be free agents to exercise an independent and nonpartisan judgment as to the men best qualified for the nation's highest offices. Well, we don't allow electors to do that, and even though the framers of the Constitution intended it. And you can get your originalists on the Supreme Court like Clarence Thomas, and they won't care in the least about that. So what happened to the Electoral College? Well, the answer is political parties. The Constitution says nothing about political parties. In fact, in Federalist number 10, Madison writes, a faction is a number of citizens who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. Leaders inflamed with them with mutual animosity and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppose each other than to cooperate for their common good. So they didn't like parties. Well, here's the problem. The very people who talked about parties being bad turned around and immediately started political parties. So you got Jefferson and Madison starts the kind of the precursor to the Democratic Party, Democratic Republicans. Hamilton and Adams become the Federalists, which is a party that dies out by the mid-1800s. So the very people that said no parties, parties are terrible, turned around and created political parties. Now this is the election statute, Arizona ARS 16212. Basically what it says is that if an elector who's on the slate that wins decides not to vote, the faithless electors decide not to vote for the candidate, the chair of the state party, be it the Republican chair or the Democratic chair, immediately removes them and puts in an elector that votes along the party line. So this is done by statute. Some states actually provide for misdemeanor and other criminal sanctions if an elector doesn't vote like they're supposed to vote. But this is Arizona statute. So the Constitution says that the legislature picks members of the Electoral College. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in Congress. Now, if you recall, Trump and his lawyers immediately jumped in and wanted the Arizona legislature to suspend or repeal Section 212 and put in a slate of Trump electors. Because their argument is, well, the legislature decides who the electors are, not the popular vote. Even though the statutes already exist, passed by the legislature, saying that, hey, look, whoever wins the popular vote gets Arizona's electors, and that slate is the slate that goes to Washington. So they went to Arizona and the other legislatures controlled by Republicans, and they tried to get the legislatures to come in and suspend that. The institution held. Even the Republican legislators did not do that. Even you got some wackos in Arizona holding meetings and having, quote, hearings about how this was supposedly a fraudulent election. Vote gets Arizona's electors, and that slate is the slate that goes to Washington. So they went to Arizona and the other legislatures controlled by Republicans, and they tried to get the legislatures to come in and suspend that. The institution held. Even the Republican legislators did not do that. Even you got some wackos in Arizona holding meetings and having, quote, hearings about how this was supposedly a fraudulent election. Now, if you recall the 3/5 clause, counting black persons as only 3/5 of a person for purpose of apportionment, something to keep in mind, the South didn't want the 3/5 clause at all. It was the North that wanted the 3/5 clause. The South would have been very happy to count each person, each black person, as a whole person for purposes of apportionment and power in Congress. But they also were very clear that those persons were not considered citizens in their states. They just wanted to count them for gaining political power in Washington. Okay, the South wanted to count every non-citizen slave that they could. So this is recently, if you recall, about a week and a half ago, there was a case argued in the Supreme Court from the Trump administration saying we don't want to count the non-citizens, okay, in the census. Well, that's all absurd. The Constitution has always counted non-citizens because it always counted slaves as whole persons. Now, they didn't have political rights. They weren't considered citizens, but they are considered persons. And I actually have a whole other talk on this, that if you have a constitution of we the people and you call slaves people, that contradiction cannot suffer to happen forever. And so basically the Constitution contemplates the end of slavery. But the point here is we have always counted non-citizens in our census. And, okay, don't count the non-citizens, says these people. Yeah, even though our great-grandpappies did. All right? So we've always counted non-citizens, and the Supreme Court punted on this until after the election when it's going to become mooted because the Biden administration is going to make sure everybody gets counted. By the way, the 3/5 clause had the effect of assuring Southern representation in the Electoral College. So the first 4 of our 6 presidents were not only Southerners but Virginians. The Adams were the only 2 Northerners because of their prominence, and they each only got 1 term each. So for the first, up until really the Civil War, the presidency was dominated by Southerners, including Andrew Jackson. Those Southerners appointed the justices of the Supreme Court, including Roger Taney, who was appointed by Jackson. So was it any big surprise that these slave-holding Southerners who get on the Supreme Court because of slave-holding Southern presidents end up making a decision like Dred Scott? None at all. Why will the Electoral College not change? Well, the reason is that in the 5 times the popular vote has been different than the Electoral College vote, okay, the Republicans have always won. 1824 is arguable. John Quincy Adams cuts a deal with Henry Clay to beat Andrew Jackson. Jackson comes back in 1830 as the first official Democratic candidate. The first convention is in Cleveland in 1830, and so that's what starts the modern Democratic Party, all right? Well, the next time we've already spoken about Rutherford B. Hayes beating Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote. James Garfield in 1880 beat Winfield Scott Hancock, a Civil War hero and general. Again, the Republican beats the Democrat. George W. Bush beats Al Gore. And, of course, in 2016, Trump beats Hillary Clinton. Every single time, the Republican loses the popular vote. The one against Hillary was the greatest margin in history, but wins the Electoral College. Republicans have always won in the Electoral College, so why would they change it? Simple matter of that. I did what was an almost impossible thing to do for a Republican, easily won the Electoral College, now tax returns are brought up again. Well, that's just other horseshit. The Republicans always win the Electoral College. All right, so how do you get rid of the Electoral College? Well, there are actually 3 ways to amend the Constitution. 2 have been used. One has been used 26 times, the other has been used once. Probably a constitutional amendment is just not going to happen. You can have a state compact. There might be a sufficient number of states now that say, okay, whoever wins the popular vote in our state, we will give our electors to them, regardless of what else happens. The other, actually, far more easier way is to apportion electors. Maine and Nebraska do not have winner-take-all provisions. As I recall, Trump, I think, picked up a delegate from Maine out of their 3 or 4, whatever. And so if this was to apply, for instance, in Arizona, if you recall, Hillary Clinton lost in Arizona by a narrow margin. Donald Trump picked up all of Arizona's 11 electors. If it would have been done like Maine and Nebraska do it, Hillary would have picked up 5 and Donald Trump would have picked up 6. I think that would make campaigning much more diverse. For instance, there is no reason that a Democratic candidate will ever go to Texas, nor will a Republican candidate ever go to California. But if you actually had a system where electors could be picked up, the campaigns would have an interest to campaign in the entire country. So I think there's a lot to be said, and it's actually the easiest way to do it. You just have to have states change their laws, and it's all controlled by state law. So that's how you could do that. Before we get to the pardon power, is there any questions people may have?
Bob, I was going to ask you about the proportional. What difference do you think it would really have made if every state was proportional in this last election? Have you ever figured that out?
No, I don't think in this last election it would have made a difference.
Yeah.
I think in 2016 it very well may have. Now I have not done the math on that, and I'd have to look at each state and how close each state was. But once you start splitting up votes, these big prizes of Florida, California, Texas, New York, all of a sudden come up for grabs. And I'd have to see what the percentages are in each state. I'm sure somebody's done that study someplace.
Yeah.
But I just think it would be a much fairer system. I mean, why does Donald Trump get 11 of Arizona's electoral votes in 2016 when he only won by a narrow margin? It's just simply unfair.
Proportionate makes a lot more sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's so much easier to pass. You just have the legislature pass that.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, we really want to hear about this pardon power thing, because
Pardon power.
you might want to address whether or not he can pardon himself,
Has he been talking
we
about
had 2 people raise their hands.
Oh, sure.
Doug has a question. Doug, you want to unmute yourself? And
the question I was going to ask, and I don't know whether now is the right time, but would you like to talk at some point about why there is so much time between the election on November 3rd, or whenever the first Tuesday is, and January the 20th, when the actual winner is seated?
It used to be longer, as I recall in the original Constitution. It is a relic of the 18th and 19th century, when it took that much time to get everything together. By the time the votes got in, okay, you're one for president, a lot went on, and just to marshal all that stuff, I think there's a good argument to be made by shortening that time a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, there would be also an argument today that a decent transfer of power may need that period of time. We obviously don't have that now because of the unqualified nature of Donald Trump. But you may actually need that power, that time to actually kind of have a good transfer of power. But I still vote for the thing. It should be changed. It's a statutory question.
All right. Bill,
we have Phil.
Bill has a question, and I should say, if you have questions, which we need to try to make them brief, okay?
You were heading in that direction. Can he pardon himself? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from somebody more now.
It's coming. It's coming.
And then one other, at some point in time, the idea of, will impeachment prevent him from running again in 2024? That's
okay.
Yeah, it's coming too.
It's coming too.
I think Doug raised his hand again.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that, for example, in the UK, the government changes hands the day after the election.
Yeah. I would point out, by the way, that there is a historical precedent for a storming of the U.S. Capitol, and that was in the War of 1812, and they were wearing red also. Okay. Yeah, no, I think, Doug, there's a lot to be said for doing that, but it's just the relic of the last 2 centuries. Okay, I guess we all want to hear about the pardon power, right?
Yes.
Presidents always like to pardon turkeys, and Donald Trump has pardoned a lot of turkeys. basically nobody ever in the history of the Republic have pardoned so many cronies and obviously guilty, unrepentant souls as this president has done. It's really just a disgusting use of the pardon power. The president shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in case of impeachment. That's Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. So it's a clear presidential power, no question. Alexander Hamilton, rather, in Federalist 74 explained, in seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth. All right. Perfect examples are Jimmy Carter pardoning the Vietnam draft evaders. Ford pardoning Nixon was probably under that same category as well. At the time, my family, myself, were very much against it, thought it was terrible. In retrospect, Ford probably did what was needed in the country to move on. And plenty of Nixon's cronies ended up going to prison anyway. So, traditionally, it had two purposes, as Hamilton talked about, to create peace after civil unrest. Another example is pardoning the Confederate soldiers after the Civil War. And it's also a holdover from when the kings used to have pardon power to give mercy in the criminal justice system for a sentence that was imposed according to law, but just out of proportion. An example of that is what Obama did with a lot of the crack versus cocaine disparity of sentencing pardons that happened under his administration. All right, pardon me. Can a president pardon himself? All right. While all agree the U.S. president has complete power to pardon, why think of that when the only time so far is leaks against us? Well, leaks, fine, whatever. As has been stated by numerous legal scholars, I don't know where he gets that from because I know he's never read a legal book in his life. I have the absolute right to pardon myself, but why would I do that when I've done nothing wrong? In the meantime, the never-ending witch hunt led by 12 very angry and conflicted Democrats and others continued into the midterms. All right. If I was Donald Trump's lawyer, I would take millions of dollars as my fee. I would have a clause that as soon as he annoyed me, I could get out and keep the millions of dollars. But I would also advise him, do not pardon yourself. A pardon is an admission of guilt. If Trump self-pardons, and he later wants to raise that as a defense to a criminal charge, it may not work. In other words, he pardoned himself, admit guilt, then a later court says, no, a president can't pardon himself. It's absurd, because the verb is a verb you do for somebody else, right? So then that would be then an admission without any benefit, which then, of course, is evidence against you of a crime. All right? So, Trump, no. Oh, he doesn't really understand these things too terribly well. If you recall when Joe Arpaio was up here and he was confronted by the fact that President Trump's pardon of him was an admission of guilt, he didn't quite get that. And it would be the same thing for Donald Trump. So, yes, he can pardon himself. Actually, until 12 noon on January 20th, Donald Trump could pardon every one of the rioters with a general amnesty for any federal crimes that they committed. I don't think they're state crimes, but they may have some state crimes involved. But he could pardon every single one of the people that stormed the Capitol. So it is an unfettered power that the Constitution gives the president. So now I'll also say is it doesn't protect the president from any state charges, and Donald Trump is going to have a world of hurt after he leaves the White House with all kinds of state charges that are predicated on the same facts that were investigated by, for instance, the Mueller report and other federal agencies. So that's the pardon power in a little packet. Any questions about that?
I have a question for you about that.
Sure.
Is there a crime that's so egregious that cannot be pardoned?
Not any federal crime. It's unfettered. There's basically no federal crime. Now, there's a lot of egregious state crimes, but essentially no. The answer under the Constitution is impeachment, removal from office, and then of course you can be charged. But remember what the pardon power says, except in cases of impeachment. All right? But no, there is no federal crime so egregious, right? Now, I'll give you an example. If Donald Trump was to go out and rob a bank, he could not be charged with federal, and he pardons himself, or let's say one of his little spawn, his kids, go and rob a bank. Eric goes and robs a bank, and Trump pardons him. Well, bank robbery is both a federal and a state crime. It's a federal crime because it's federally insured, right? But it's a state robbery. So little Eric can still get charged in the state where the bank was for a robbery of a bank, just not the federal crime of bank robbery. Okay? So that's the way that is.
All right.
Well, let's talk about the 25th Amendment. The 25th Amendment is for the transition of a unfit or unstable or unable president. It was after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. If you recall, he was actually in a coma for a while, and there was a question of, well, he obviously can't function in the job. Who's in charge? Well, Congress proposed and the states ratified the 25th Amendment in 1967 in response. Formally outlines a transition of power. Before that, the vice president officially didn't have power to take over, okay, until the president was actually dead. So for an unfit president, that's where this whole thing happened. All right. Trump reportedly didn't know about the 25th Amendment, what it did. Former advisor Steve Bannon told him it would pose the biggest threat to his presidency, and Trump's response was, what's that? Meaning, what's the 25th Amendment? So, basically, Section 1 provides for removal whenever there's a vacancy. Okay, if you recall, Gerald Ford was never elected to be vice president or president. Spiro Agnew got knocked out. Ford came in. Then Nixon resigns. Ford becomes president, turns around and pardons Nixon, etc. That's what the 25th Amendment provides for. There was an episode of West Wing, okay, entitled 25. It's the 88th episode of season 4, the season 4 finale of West Wing. That's where it's come into play. Basically, look, the 25th Amendment, to simplify this down, 14 people can depose a president. It would be the Vice President, Mike Pence, and 13 of Trump's 24 cabinet members. Now, you've got all of Trump's cabinet members who are resigning. I think they're utterly gutless, because when they resign, they're not in a position to sign the articles under the 25th Amendment. I would prefer that they stay there and invoke the 25th Amendment, but I doubt Mike Pence is going to do that. And they all have some notion that if they keep Trump voters on their side, they're going to become something someday. At any rate, that's how it works. Now, there was another movie, Air Force One, with Harrison Ford, and there was a question about whether you sign the articles under the 25th Amendment because he's on a plane with terrorists and his daughter's held kidnapped and blah, blah, blah. It provided a really good plot line, but that's about the extent of how the 25th Amendment really comes into play. An episode of West Wing and the movie Air Force One. Okay. You know, when Bush got a colonoscopy, okay, he signs over the thing, and then he shall resume the powers and the duties of office after he comes out of his colonoscopy. Okay, so Dick Cheney's president, or ex is president until Bush comes out of not the coma, but the anesthetics, right? So, okay, Dick, hand it back over. That's what the 25th Amendment provides. Now, again, you know, this can get into a little bit of detail. This is a really badly written amendment because it's unclear. But basically, 2/3 vote of the houses can remove the president. So the president says, hey, this is wrong, I shouldn't be removed. Within 21 days, they have a hearing. And by 2/3 vote of both houses, then he can be removed. All right, so they can overrule those 14, the vice president and 13 cabinet members. But it has to happen within 21 days, and by a 2/3 vote of both houses, he's removed. If not, he's still president. All right. So in this context, really, they could remove him from office until because we've got 13 days left. So before there would even be a vote in both houses as to whether he's president, he could be removed right now under the 25th Amendment. There would never be a vote in time for Joe Biden to take over. Frankly, that's what I would have liked to have seen, but, I don't think that's going to happen. All right. So, I'll talk about Trump and impeachment unless you got a question about that mechanism. Like I said, it's a really badly written amendment. It's just a mess.
Robert, I got a quick question for you.
Sure.
Of those 24 cabinet members, there are 5 acting members. They haven't been approved by the Congress yet. Do those 5 acting members get a vote in invoking the 25th?
Very good question. I have taken it upon myself to show the courage to say when I don't know an answer, I tell you I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. It's a very good question, though.
Can there be a combination of cabinet members and Senate, or does it have to be clearly one or the other?
25th Amendment just says the cabinet, vice president and the cabinet.
Wow.
It's essentially an executive branch function, not a legislative branch function.
What? Okay. Oh, one last question. This is hypothetical. Is if they do evoke Trump and Pence decides that he is not willing to do it, then who is next in line to be the president?
Well, the next in line is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Bring in Nancy Pelosi.
Okay. And they don't want to do that. All right. Thank you.
And then I think it goes to the Secretary of State.
Okay, there is a question from Phil Nicolay. Phil, is it about the 25th?
I had it up before we got to this point.
Oh, okay.
So I just want to be clear. The president is in fact above the law because he can pardon himself. He can kill somebody and turn around and say, too bad.
Okay. Well, okay, that gets into a whole another complicated thing. I do not think the president is above the law. There's all kinds of checks and balances, number one. Number two, if he kills somebody, it has to be a federal jurisdiction for a federal crime. And there's very few federal homicide statutes that are so he can actually be charged under a state crime. It may have to wait till after he's president, but he still can be. And all of these issues in the Mueller report, I don't think the statute of limitation runs. So he can still be charged with all this stuff. It's just not while he's president. What the Mueller report was clear, and it's been Department of Justice policy for decades, is that because the president ultimately is in control of all the mechanisms of prosecution, you can't charge and prosecute a sitting president. But the moment he steps out of office, he can be charged with everything.
Good. There is a chat from Angie who said that the TV show Madam Secretary has an excellent episode about the 25th Amendment.
Okay. Now this is crucially important. Shoot me an email with that episode, and I'll include it in the next talk.
Oh, okay.
I think I never saw Madam Secretary, but I actually heard about that one because she was like, when she's scheming the whole time about how she was going to become president that way or something.
Like that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It wasn't that devious. It wasn't that devious. It was the president had it, unbeknownst to anyone, a tumor affecting his brain and his reactions that way.
Oh. Well, I'll be sure to include that in future versions of the talk. Send me an email and remind me, and I'll include that in future versions of the talk. Okay, so now we have 3 examples of where the 25th Amendment is relevant. Because, frankly, the way it's written, it's hard for it to be relevant now, where we really need it. All right. So let's go on to Trump and impeachment. We've been down this road before. The president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, other high crimes, and misdemeanors. All right. House of Representatives impeach. Impeachment is just an indictment. That's all it is. It's not a conviction. The Senate tries all impeachments. Impeachable officials, it counts as an automatic removal from office. And the judiciary cannot review an impeachment. It's purely a legislative and political function. Article 1, Section 3 also provides for disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. So what usually happens is when the Senate convicts somebody after they've been impeached by the House, it immediately goes to a vote with a simple majority, not the 3/5 that are required for the conviction, to decide whether they should be disqualified from holding future office. That's happened with 2 or 3 federal judges over the past. And so the entire purpose of having an impeachment proceeding now, which will not be tried in this Senate until after Joe Biden takes the oath of office, is an entire argument as to whether Donald Trump should ever be able to run for president again, or whether he will be constitutionally precluded and shut down. My guess is that the bigger political strategy of this is, first of all, get the Republicans having to go online as either defending or attacking the president, further kind of increasing the rift and the civil war within the Republican Party, and to keep them talking about this and focused on the foibles of Donald Trump rather than doing anything else. In other words, I think the Republican parties deservedly are going to face a huge civil war. It's going to be the Trump party versus what I would consider to be the good, decent Republicans who you can have honest disagreements with policy about versus this ugly populism stuff. And so that could keep that whole thing going. So, on the other hand, smart Republicans would want to remove Trump permanently because, let's say you're a halfway decent Republican who wants to run for president. Look, that guy sucks all the oxygen out of the room and really helps the Democrats, quite frankly. So I think that's a long-term strategy other than just kind of appeasing the members of the House of Representatives, the Democrats, who want to go with this impeachment now. So that's my political analysis of that. And, I've never been wrong on a political analysis, forget 2016. Okay. So an impeachment is a charge comparable to an indictment or complaint. As I said, the trial is in the Senate. The Senate shall have the sole power to trial impeachments. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. No person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. This is William Rehnquist presiding over the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton. The story is that if you notice, Supreme Court justices do not have stripes on their robe. But the story was that Rehnquist had apparently seen HMS Pinafore before and liked the Chief Justice's robes, so he got himself a robe with stripes for purposes of the hearings. So that's why he happens to have stripes on his robe there. All right. In Federalist 65, again, Alexander Hamilton, impeachment is for offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may, with a peculiar propriety, be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injustices done immediately to society itself. So that's the purpose of impeachment. 1970 House Minority Leader Gerald Ford said, an impeachable offense is whatever a majority of the House of Representatives considers it to be at that given moment in history. So that's the standard. And if you recall, the Republicans put a pretty damn low standard for the Clinton case. It's a pretty low bar. Okay, obstruction for justice for lying about his sexual affair, and he was acquitted in the Senate, of course. So that was a pretty low standard as far as that goes. Okay, I did not have. Nah, just kidding. I totally did. Okay, fine, whatever. All right. There's no questions about impeachment. I was going to kind of wrap this up with the effect of Trumpism, at least as I see it, summing up this administration. So if there's no questions, I'll go ahead and go forward with that.
Okay, if people could hold off their questions till you're finished then.
Okay, that's fine. Good, we can have a good talk afterward, but let's go ahead and get through this. The effect of Trumpism. There's often comparisons of Trump and Nazism. Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler. I think those comparisons are actually profoundly unfair. And the reason why I think they're unfair is Donald Trump is not as talented as Adolf Hitler was. Simple a matter as that. Adolf Hitler wrote his own book. Donald Trump had to have a ghostwriter write his book, Tony Schwartz. Donald Trump did not write The Art of the Deal. He had Schwartz do it for him, okay? Adolf Hitler had real talents, horrible as they were. Donald Trump does not. Trump has worked fundamentally within the context of institutions. throughout his whole presidency. Start with the Electoral College, the office of the presidency, Congress and the courts. You know, he says terrible things about judges and courts, but when the rulings come down, he actually doesn't defy them. Now, there have been presidents in American history who have. Andrew Jackson, for instance, defies John Marshall in the Cherokee Nation cases. Donald Trump and the administration did not do this at all. Frankly, I think he's hapless regarding the Constitution. He never really understood or understands how it works. When he was running for office, he talks about enthusiastically supporting the Constitution. On the 7th of July, 2016, Donald Trump enthusiastically proclaims his support for the whole Constitution. This is a big Republican thing about we're the constitutionalists protecting the Constitution. They're totally wrong, but that's their claim, right? And Trump actually makes the claim, not only will I stand up for Article 1, I'll stand up for Article 2, Article 12, you name it, of the Constitution. Okay. The United States Constitution only has 7 articles, right? And frankly, you only got to worry about 6 because Article 7 was just about setting up the whole government anyway, which was already done back in the late 1700s, okay? So it only has 7 articles. It has been, of course, amended 27 times, unless you don't count the 18th Amendment, which was repealed by the 21st Amendment, in which case it's actually kind of only been amended 26 times, or actually 25, right? Those two cancel each other out. Oh, by the way, if you want to know how to remember that and look kind of smart at a cocktail party, you know, what's the drinking age in some states? 18. The drinking age in other states is 21. So, the 18th Amendment repealed by the 21st Amendment. So 18 and 21, that's all you have to remember. All right. Trump and executive orders. Many are subject to court challenge, but all basically within the president's power. Now, we can have a valid argument with Republicans, because remember, they were whining about this stuff with Barack Obama like nobody's business. Donald Trump far eclipsed anything that Barack Obama did with executive orders, like the whole DACA thing. He has done, I think, a record in executive orders. They are within the recognized powers of the president today. I think we can have a valid argument whether that's the way it should be, that was not the intent of the framers or whatnot, but that is the power that the president has. And Joe Biden, with one order, could actually walk in at 12:01 on January 20th and sign an order that says all those orders Trump did are just negated. Boom. The next president can come in and negate them. Okay? This is within the existing powers and institutions. 2 presidents fundamentally changed the nature of the Constitution. I was worried initially that Donald Trump would be the 3rd president that could fundamentally change the nature of the Constitution. He turned out not to be. The first, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. We live in a fundamentally different country because of Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, his response to it, and his Emancipation Proclamation, his basic pushing through the 13th Amendment, which, if you recall, with Daniel Day-Lewis, Abraham Lincoln movie, really, really well done and fundamentally historically accurate, fundamentally changed the Constitution, Abraham Lincoln. The second was Franklin Roosevelt, the response to the Depression and World War II, mostly through legislation, but then he got the courts to finally back him on those, creating the New Deal, creating Social Security, the different nation that we live in because of Franklin Roosevelt, and most people truly, deeply support. Those 2 presidents, more than any others, changed the nature of our constitutional republic. Okay. Donald Trump has not. He has had only 1 major legislation in 4 years. Only 1. And that is the tax bill. And frankly, I don't think it was his achievement at all. I think it was Paul Ryan's achievement, if you want to call it an achievement. This was Paul Ryan's baby. Donald Trump was just there along for the ride. Nothing else. Immigration reform? No. Infrastructure reform? No. Absolutely nothing. He has proven to have no ability to reach a consensus on anything with anybody. Okay? Only 1 major legislation the entire time. Sure, there's little statutes passed and other things. Just doesn't have much a role in that and no credit for it. The profound impact that Trump so-called had on the judiciary is not Trump's achievement. That is Mitch McConnell's achievement. Mitch McConnell has been lining this up for decades. And he got Trump to do what he wants, basically select judges who are approved by the Federalist Society. But that's Mitch's achievement, not Donald Trump's. We've been here before in terms of this. The Judiciary Act of 1801 put a bunch of Federalists on the federal courts. John Marshall was head of the U.S. Supreme Court, shaped the modern court as we know it. Marbury versus Madison dealt with this constitutional issue. Federalist control of the courts lasted for a generation. Well, the country survived that. And the country grew and constitutionally and rights expanded and increased despite that Federalist control, and sometimes because of that Federalist control. So, not all the things these judges are going to do are going to be bad. Yeah, there's a lot of bad that's going to come from it. And let's not forget, too, Clarence Thomas is the next oldest justice. So he could be the next one that drops. And that then starts to put the court back in balance. Okay. There is still a fundamental question about Donald Trump. Did Trump understand our institutions well enough to destroy them? I don't think he got it. I don't think he ever got it. I worry in the future that there'll be an ugly populist who kind of does get it and is actually much more evil than Donald Trump. Donald Trump's just a crazy, self-absorbed narcissist. I also am not one of these people that attribute any higher strategic ability to his thinking when he does things. I think he has a series of ingrained neurotic behaviors that have been rewarded his whole life, which got him to this point. Turning Point USA. Okay, I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. That's not a typo. That's the way he speaks. But I don't even talk about that. Okay, Richard Nixon. When the president does it, that means it's not illegal. This is just kind of comical, in a sense, in an ugly sense of comical. Attacking institutions, sure, he attacks them, but he's never actually broken one. And they have a common quality. Look, fake news media, failing New York Times, NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, blah, 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 is not Miami, it's Miami people. Hey, you know, the subscription department of the New York Times loves it when he says this. Their subscriptions have never been better. We shall overcome. Again, the guy just kind of has a bit of a comic quality. And I think most people see him that way. We are a little more in tune and I think have much better values and have much deeper, profound worries. But most people just think he's kind of an idiot. Make America Again necktie. During these speeches, I thought maybe I'd buy one of these neckties to have while I'm talking about Donald Trump. There was one that I found that was online for $168. I probably should have bought it because it was actually signed by Stormy Daniels. If I could have verified the signature, I probably should have bought it as a probably be very valuable as time goes on. Again, a president selling neckties. That's just weird. Oh, and just for the record, he didn't know how to wear a tie. You don't wear a tie that low, kind of hanging around your junk. It's supposed to be at the belt level, but okay, pet peeve. Anyway, why do we have these institutions in this country? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In forming a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. That's why we've created these institutions. They have fundamentally worked and held until 2 days ago. Okay? We have strong institutions that have held until this. Now, as institutions go, it is actually not the worst. Lasted a few hours, everything still functions, etc. But it was a true break. And I think it hit home for people that this guy is horrible. He actually finally went too far. And something broke. We even had Mitch McConnell saying something that sounded admirable. I don't think I've ever heard Mitch McConnell say anything that I admired until he spoke in reaction to this. All right? Ted Cruz and Hawley, the two senators, they're getting ostracized by other Republicans now, for God's sakes. All right. I think something broke for the first time. And it wasn't the worst thing that broke. It's like not something related to the nuclear codes, right? Fundamentally, the election's still taking effect, etc., etc. We have good days ahead of us. But this symbolized everything, and this is the legacy of the Trump administration, that he broke something sacred. We still have our institutions, and the institutions are still strong. They have survived, they've been strained, but they have survived the 4 years. I don't know that they would have survived 4 more years, and thank God we don't have to worry about that. And we still had the right to vote. And it's interesting, if you look at the substance of any charge about voting, maybe some of these Republican arguments have merit, maybe they don't, but why is it that the Republicans always are on the side of limiting the right to vote when we are always on the side of expanding the right to vote? We're on the right side of history, period. Leaving aside whatever merit they may have in a given argument. They're just in the wrong place. So, that is still there. The greatest menace to freedom is an inert people. Louis Brandeis. We are a much more engaged, certainly Democratic Party, and I think nation, after Donald Trump because of him. The point has always been to learn about the Constitution in these talks. Thucydides, who the framers all read, wrote, "Here in Athens, each individual is interested not only in his own affairs, but in the affairs of the state as well. Of all people, we alone do not say that a man who takes no interest in politics is a man who minds his own business, but we say that he is useless." The Greek word idiot wasn't somebody who was limited mentally. It was somebody who is incapable of engaging in the public sphere. Idiots versus pelotes, or pelots, pilos, police, politics, metropolis, all those words. That is the publicly engaged citizen versus the idiots. Okay? We don't want to be idiots. Certainly not in the modern sense, but not in the Greek sense as well, as the framers understood that. The point is to make the Constitution great again. And these 4 years have been a real test. But the institutions of hold and the legacy of this man has been nothing but ugly, as was punctuated just a few days ago. So, let's make the Constitution great again.
Fantastic, fantastic, and wonderful. Okay, how's that?
Terrific.
I do have a question for you.
Sure.
Trump kept saying to his people that Mike Pence could overturn the electoral votes by the Constitution, I think. What is your response to that? We just make it up?
Look, my response is all of these things. You know, Vladimir Putin, the dictator, vicious dictator of Russia, stays in power by, quote, legal methods. There's always some legal argument you can make. The role of the vice president in tabulating those votes, clearly by the framers of the Constitution, was to be just a mechanical process. But, yeah, it says he's supposed to count it and certify it, and could he stand up and do that? And let's say you had Republicans in control of both houses, and they were all nutty like Ted Cruz. Could they do that? I suppose they could, but the backlash of people and the delegitimation of that would be very profound. Yeah, there's a mechanism that says the vice president is supposed to do that, but Pence himself knew that's craziness. So...